Slay the Spire is probably the world's first roguelike deck building video game. It's easily my favourite game at the moment, and I'm not alone. At time of writing, it has an overwhelmingly positive score on Steam, despite being in early access. In this video, I'm going to give an overview of the game and talk about why I think the format works so well. In Slay the Spire, players take control of either the Ironclad or the Silent, and fight their way through a series of procedurally generated encounters, powering up and eventually facing off against challenging bosses. Battles are turn-based and revolve around playing cards. Each turn, the player draws a hand of 5 cards, which permit actions like dealing damage to enemies, mitigating damage from attacks, and applying status effects. Each card has an energy cost, and each turn players get a pool of energy, usually 3, with which to play cards. Enemies don't play cards, but rather complete simple actions like attacking or applying status effects. These actions are telegraphed to the player, and a large part of battle tactics come from preempting and mitigating an opponent's next move. After each victory, players can choose one of 3 new cards to add to their deck. These cards are usually character specific, and fit to the archetype of each character. The Ironclad is a warrior, and has a lot of cards featuring buffs and heavy attacks. The Silent is a rogue or assassin, and their cards feature mobility, card draw, and indirect damage. Monsters also drop money and potions, which are single-use items that provide short-term buffs. Outside of combat, players will encounter merchants selling new cards and items, and non-combat scenes where the player can choose between different positive and negative outcomes. Occasionally, players will find relics, powerful items that grant significant changes to the game. Some relics just provide passive advantages, such as HP regeneration or extra card draw, but the more interesting relics completely change the flow of the game. For example, one relic permanently increases your energy pool by 1, but prevents you from gaining any more gold. The process is thoroughly streamlined. Between encounters, players progress along a map and choose which branching path to take. It's linear enough to give Final Fantasy XIII a run for its money. Crucially, death in Slay the Spire is permanent. Upon dropping to 0 HP, the game is over, and the player will have to start from the very beginning without any of the extra cards or relics. Slay the Spire may sound simple, and it is, yet it's the masterful combination of the roguelike and deck building genres that makes it stand out. These two genres receive a fair amount of love in the modern market, but few developers manage to execute them successfully. I'll explain why I think that is, and how Slay the Spire manages to overcome the challenges of these genres to deliver something original and involving. The roguelike genre takes its name from Rogue, a 1980 dungeon crawling RPG. Roguelikes are characterised by a number of features. Most take place in a randomised or procedurally generated dungeon that is different in every playthrough. Players must journey through the dungeon, fighting monsters and collecting items, while hunting for the stairs that will take them to the next, progressively more difficult floor. There's a vague order to the monsters and items, with tougher enemies and better loot found in the later floors, but they too are unpredictable and different in every playthrough. Another staple of the roguelike is permanent death. Dying normally means returning to level 1, losing all your items and having to start from the entrance of a dungeon. But that's okay. The procedurally generated nature of the dungeon means that each new playthrough will offer new challenges and surprises. Well, that's the hope anyway. Rogue was released in a time when permanent death was pretty normal in both tabletop and computer role-playing games. In tabletop systems like AD&D and Traveller, part of the fun was rolling up a new character and seeing how far you could take them before they get killed. Combat was lethal, and the expectation was that not everyone would make it through the campaign. Over the years, tabletop players shifted from deadly dungeon crawling to complex narrative arcs, character development and long-term goals. Each new iteration of D&D has made it less likely for characters to die. The typical campaigns that I play today see a party of adventurers progressing through a complex story. Character death is rare, disruptive, and when it does happen, the player is usually allowed to roll a new character at a comparable level and wealth, rather than start back at level 1. Computer RPGs have gone the same way as well. Big names like Final Fantasy are known for, among other things, their character development systems and their elaborate narratives. Roguelikes stand at odds with conventional RPGs in these regards. The plot is usually quite thin on the ground, so that the constant death and reset cycle doesn't break up the flow of the game. Whatever plot there is tends to sit apart from the dungeon crawling gameplay, as the unpredictable nature of the dungeon makes it hard to weave a narrative into. Similarly, both leveling and crafting systems are either non-existent or very basic. What's the point of spending time developing your character if they're only going to be reset in half an hour? I honestly do enjoy roguelikes a great deal, but their lack of intelligent structure and the permanent death do wear me down after a while. They're fun in short bursts, but I seldom want to lose myself in a roguelike in the same way I do with a JRPG. The roguelike genre has had a resurgence in the past couple of years, but it's telling that most of the popular modern roguelikes have shifted away from the classic formula in one way or another. Some eschew permanent death, like Pokemon Mystery Dungeon, while others choose real-time action over turn-based combat, like The Binding of Isaac or Rogue Legacy. Card game themed video games, that's quite a mouthful, and nothing new. The majority build on recognised card games like Magic the Gathering or Yu-Gi-Oh! There are of course many different kinds of card game, but I'm going to focus on two of the most popular: collectible card games and deck building games. Collectible card games, or CCGs for short, were popularised in the early 90s by Magic the Gathering, and are the lifeblood of most gaming stores today. Players build decks from a pool of thousands of possible cards, and then battle against other people's decks. While tactics are certainly required during matches, it's often said that CCGs are won before they've even begun, determined by who had built the better deck and executed the better strategy. With lots of viable strategies available at any time, the key to success is to understand the metagame. Put simply, what cards and strategies other people are likely to be playing. By predicting the cards in your opponent's deck, you can preempt them, and build a deck that will counter theirs. Not all formats of CCGs let you build a deck with whichever cards you like, however. As newer card sets are released, older cards are no longer allowed in tournaments, meaning that competitive players have to tweak or rebuild their decks as old cards cycle out and new cards cycle in. In a sealed format, players are given a number of booster packs and challenged to build a functioning deck from whatever is inside. In a draft, players take it in turns to draw from a shared pool of cards in order to build decks. Decks built in these formats are obviously less efficient than constructed decks, but their limitations add an extra level of challenge. In particular, drafts further complicate the metagame. By predicting the strategies that your opponent will try to use, you can hate draft by taking cards that they'll want during the drafting phase, thereby weakening their deck before they've even built it. These formats have been perfected by deck building board games, first made popular by Rio Grande's Dominion. In deck building games, players slowly construct their decks over the course of the game, towards a defined goal. For example, in Dominion, each player starts with a deck comprised of copper coin cards, which they use to buy better cards to add to their deck. New cards will allow them to do things like draw and play more cards, produce more money, or attack their opponent. Ultimately, players work towards building expensive victory point cards, which enable them to win the game. Key to deck building board games is the idea of the cycling deck. Rather than losing when you run out of cards, you shuffle your discard pile and it becomes your new deck, so you play each card multiple times in a given match. Lots of computer card games mimic the style of CCGs, but few do so successfully, and many actually come closer to the feel of an RPG than a CCG. In computer card games, players often start with a weak deck and have to win better cards by defeating opponents. By grinding weak opponents and adding new cards to their deck, they can slowly progress to fight stronger opponents. Their deck gradually gets stronger throughout the campaign, and never reverts back to its original state. Not only does this turn the game into a sluggish grindfest, but it also waters down the deck building which is central to CCGs. The metagame is usually pretty weak in computer card games. Opponents are battled sequentially and have fixed decks. The player just has to make a deck which is strong against their opponent's particular strategy, beat them and then move on to the next opponent. This is far less unpredictable than in actual CCGs, and there is much less scope for strategizing. So while there are plenty of decent computer roguelikes and card games available, few of them really flourish or stand out as gold standard games. Those which do tend to deviate from the core concepts of the genre in one way or another. But by synergizing the two kinds of games, Slay the Spire stays true to many of the conventions whilst producing an original standout game. How does it do this? Well, firstly, the transient nature of a roguelike run means that the slow progression seen in most computer card games is thrown out. It's possible to build a very strong Slay the Spire deck in half an hour, allowing players to stomp through a campaign quickly. But both their deck and their opponents will be reset for their next run, meaning they can start from scratch against beginner enemies. This cycle of constantly building and rebuilding your deck in response to previous experience is much closer to the way that real CCGs are actually played. I'd go as far as to say that Slay the Spire actually imitates the metagame better than any other computer game I've played. There are a huge number of different possible encounters, each of which behave differently. Encounters are randomised, so players never know who their next opponents are going to be. This means that instead of making a deck that will be strong against the next opponent, players have to predict and preempt possible future encounters and then build accordingly. For example, I love building decks where I can poison opponents and then defend while the poison slowly kills them, but I run the risk of coming up against a monster that has a hard counter against poison. So rather than building a deck that just does poison very efficiently, I'm better off building for several different eventualities. The transient and unpredictability of the roguelike helps to make Slay the Spire more like a real card game than most computerized offerings. But how does the card game aspect help Slay the Spire as a roguelike? Well, the card system also adds a remarkable level of depth to battle tactics. Tactics in roguelikes are typically thin on the ground. The best approach is often to spam your basic attack until all nearby enemies are dead, and then rest until your HP is restored. Having a host of different cards, potions and relics to play with gives me more scope for long-term strategizing and short-term tactics than any other roguelike I've played, ever. Adding deck building into the mix also makes me feel a lot better about permadeath. In classic roguelikes, death is often caused by a spate of bad luck. It can be very jarring to lose a character this way when you spent an hour or more leveling up. Character death in Slay the Spire is usually caused by suboptimal deck building, or poor tactical decisions. rather than solely because of bad luck. And while starting from scratch feels odd in an RPG, it's perfectly natural in a card game. To play a CCG is to be constantly building and refining new decks. The randomness of card draw also works really well. In a traditional roguelike, success or failure can often be determined by whether or not you find good items. While it can be fun to find a powerful weapon early, it can also be frustrating to get killed because you didn't find any decent equipment. This again is not so much of an issue in Slay the Spire. While card drops are randomised, you always get a choice of 3, and while some cards are better than others, the relative power is not that clear cut. These two factors completely change the dynamic of randomised loot. You're no longer crossing your fingers hoping to pick up the weapons and potions you'll need to make it through to the next floor. Instead, you're working out how best to make use of the random cards you've been offered. Again, it adds a lot more strategy and makes each run feel more satisfying. In summary, Slay the Spire's randomness and permadeath make it feel more like a real CCG, while its deck building mechanics take the edge off the simplicity and repetition seen in many roguelikes. If there's one thing that Slay the Spire doesn't address particularly well, it's the story. As with many roguelikes, it's close to non-existent. I've mentioned this as a weakness for the sake of balance, but personally I don't think that it's much of an issue. Both roguelikes and computer card games tend to have pretty bad stories, and I'd rather have a bare-bones narrative than a badly written, convoluted one. Still, Slay the Spire is in early access, and maybe a story mode is something they'd think about in the future. So that's Slay the Spire and why I think it works so well. If you like card games, roguelikes or RPGs in general, then I'd recommend you give it a look. Thanks to everyone listed on the screen here for providing gaming footage for this video. Links to their channels are in the description below, and if you'd like to watch any more of my videos, they're on the screen right now.